November 21st, Putin announces total victory in Kupyansk. He states that the city is completely under Russian control. A few weeks later, on December 12th, Zelensky records this. He says, "Many Russians talked about Kupyansk. We see how things really are." Wait, that doesn't make sense. If the city is under Russian control, how is the Ukrainian president personally inside it in the death zone?
На фронті, щоб Україна могла досягати результатів в дипломатії.
One of those versions is a lie. The other, well, it just destroyed Putin's entire strategy for the peace negotiations. Let's start from the beginning.
Соединения группировки «Запад» освободили город Купянск.
November 20th, 2025, Putin appears on Russian television dressed in a military uniform. It's not just any uniform, it's pure theater, a performance for the Russian people. Next to him is General Valery Gerasimov, the military commander of the Russian armed forces, and it's Gerasimov who makes the announcement. Troops from the western sector have liberated the city of Kupyansk and continued the destruction of Ukrainian forces. On the left bank of the Oskil River, Putin doesn't let it go. He must confirm and ask the question that will be recorded forever. He then says, does this mean it's over, it's finished, it's completely under our control? Gerasimov responds with military precision, yes sir, exactly, the city is completely under our control. There it was declared, Kupyansk had fallen. Russian state television broadcast this news on all channels. Newspapers published headlines celebrating the victory. Putin had just delivered to the Russian people yet another achievement in the war that had already lasted almost 4 years. But there was a problem, a huge problem. None of this was true. While Putin was declaring victory on television, Ukrainian soldiers inside Kupyansk were watching the announcement. And do you know what they did? They laughed. They filmed themselves laughing at the Russian statements because they were there on the ground and knew exactly what the reality was. The city was nowhere near Russian control. Before you understand why Putin made up this story, you need to understand why Kupyansk matters so much, why this city became the center of such a bold lie. Kupyansk isn't just a city, it's a crucial supply point. 5 railway lines meet there. Whoever controls Kupyansk controls the transport of supplies, weapons, and soldiers for the entire Kharkiv and Luhansk region. For the Russians, capturing this city would be like opening a direct door to eastern Ukraine. They could move heavy equipment by rail, which is infinitely more efficient than road transport for tanks and artillery. And there's more. Kupyansk is located on the banks of the Oskil River, and this river has become a natural defensive line for Ukraine. If the Russians managed to cross and take the city, they would force the Ukrainians to retreat to much worse positions. Losing Kupyansk would mean losing the entire defense system of the region. Now comes the diplomatic part, and this is where things get really interesting. A few weeks ago, peace talks were gaining momentum in the new Trump administration. Several negotiation plans were circulating, including a controversial plan with 28 proposals, which included recognizing occupied territories and limiting the size of the Ukrainian army. Putin needed leverage. He needed to sit at the negotiating table and say, look at the map, we control these cities, you need to recognize that. And Kupyansk was one of the key pieces of that strategy. He could present the capture of the city as something already accomplished. He could use that to force Ukraine to accept the Oskil River as the border in the agreement. The problem? The reality on the ground was completely different from what Putin was declaring on television. Yes, the Russians had managed to infiltrate small groups into the city, but infiltrating is not the same as controlling. Their tactic was strange, actually, quite desperate. The Russians found out they could no longer move on the surface. Ukrainian drones cover absolutely everything. Any movement outdoors is detected and attacked within minutes. So they found a creative solution, an abandoned oil pipeline. These Russian soldiers crawled through underground pipelines to enter the city without being detected by drones. It's like going back to medieval warfare, but with a modern reason. Drone technology has forced the Russians to literally bury themselves to survive. Here's the thing. These infiltrated groups had no way to maintain control. They were isolated, without adequate supplies, surrounded by Ukrainian forces. Kupyansk was a contested area, with intense urban combat, not a safe city under Russian control. Outsiders began to debunk the Kremlin story. Even Russian military bloggers who always support the war admitted that Kupyansk was not under control. The city wasn't captured, it was contested. And then comes Putin with that risky move. On December 2, Putin issues a public invitation. He called international journalists, even Ukrainian journalists, to visit Kupyansk and see with their own eyes that the city was under Russian control. The invitation was real.
The Ukrainian side are ready to suspend hostilities for several hours, 2, 3, or 6 hours, to allow a group of journalists to enter those areas. See what's going on there, talk to Ukrainian troops there, and move out.
The problem is the Kremlin never made it easier for journalists to enter. The reason is simple. It would reveal the whole farce. But there was someone who accepted the invitation, and he wasn't a journalist. On December the 12th, Volodymyr Zelensky appears in Kupyansk. Even the president of Ukraine travels to a city that was supposedly under total Russian control. 3 weeks earlier, he records a video 2.6 kilometers from the city center. He's wearing a bulletproof vest, and you can hear explosions in the background. The fighting is still going on, but he's there, physically present, smiling, talking to Ukrainian soldiers, sending a very clear message. Today, it's extremely important to achieve results on the front line so that Ukraine can achieve results in diplomacy. That's exactly how it works. Strong positions within the country means strong positions in talks about ending the war. That visit wasn't just brave, it was a smart move. Zelensky proved with his own presence that Putin was lying, and more importantly, he was showing that the front line wasn't where Moscow claimed it to be. The city wasn't lost, Ukraine was still fighting for it, but the story doesn't end there. The Kartia Brigade, a group of experienced soldiers who fought in Bakhmut and defended Kharkiv since the beginning of the war, launched a devastating counterattack. This brigade has between 1,500 and 5,000 extremely well-trained soldiers. They knew exactly what they were doing. The first target, that pipeline the Russians used to sneak in, the Achilles Regiment, a special forces unit, completely destroyed the pipeline. With that, the Russians' secret supply routes simply ceased to exist. The infiltrated soldiers were completely isolated, so then came the cleanup operation. The Kartia Brigade liberated the residential district of Yuvileny in the southwest of Kupyansk. This district is on high ground, which gives a position to fire over the entire city. The Ukrainians used explosives to demolish tall buildings that were being occupied by Russian snipers, literally blinding the Russian troops in the region. And here is the most ironic part. This whole story reminds us that Putin said 15 Ukrainian battalions were surrounded in Kupyansk, another made-up number. Do you know who actually ended up surrounded? 200 Russian soldiers, not 15 Ukrainian battalions. 200 Russians cut off from supplies, trapped with no way out in the industrial districts of the city. So the Russian command tried something desperate. They started using cargo drones to try to resupply those trapped soldiers. But there's a detail that shows their level of priority. Some drones carried Russian flags instead of food or ammo. Flags to take propaganda photos, proving they were there while the soldiers were starving. The final result of this operation was shocking. More than 1,000 Russian soldiers killed, villages around Kupyansk liberated, Radkivka and Kindrashivka, which were used as Russian supply points, retaken by Ukrainian forces, and those 200 Russian soldiers completely trapped with no escape route, no supplies. After that, the reaction in Russia was quite revealing. The Ministry of Defense stayed silent. The state media didn't say anything at all about the collapse in Kupyansk. It's as if they were trying to maintain a narrative. It was falling apart right before their eyes. But the Russian military bloggers, they did speak out. A channel called Military Informant admitted it. Taking advantage of the weak control of the Russian armed forces in the city, despite optimistic reports of its complete capture, the enemy launched a counterattack. Another channel called Western Forces Group was even harsher. Everything is going badly for the Russian forces. Now comes the part that really matters. After all, why did all this happen? Why did Putin risk his credibility with a lie that could be so easily disproved? And the answer, well, is... in that diplomatic context I mentioned earlier, Putin was in a race against time. He knew that peace negotiations were speeding up. He knew that the new American administration could push for a ceasefire, and he desperately needed territorial gains to show strength. At the negotiating table, a Kremlin aide, Yuri Ushakov, made that very clear. The progress and nature of the negotiations were influenced by the successes of the Russian army on the battlefield in recent weeks. Our Russian soldiers, through their victories, helped make our partners' assessments, and those of foreigners, about the paths to a peace agreement more appropriate. In other words, this means that the more victories Putin could declare, the more bargaining power he would have to force Ukraine to give up territory. But this strategy had a fatal flaw. It depended on everyone believing the lie. The problem is that Putin made the classic mistake of confusing his own reports with reality. He announced a victory that didn't exist, hoping that it would eventually become reality. But modern warfare isn't like that. There are drones filming everything, there are independent observers, there's the Ukrainian president himself, who can simply show up in the captured city and prove it's a lie, and the cost of that lie was extremely high. Putin lost exactly the bargaining power he was trying to gain, instead of sitting at the negotiating table saying, "Look how many cities we've captured." Now he has to explain why the Ukrainian president was filming in a city that was supposedly under total Russian control. Even worse, the pattern repeated itself. On the same day as the counterattack in Kupyansk, Russia claimed to have captured another city, Siversk. Same story, infiltrated groups in the disputed area, fictitious control, a completely different reality on the ground. This shows a serious problem for Russia. The Kremlin is so focused on telling pretty stories that it has lost touch with what's really happening on the battlefield. They declare victories for the Russian people to see and to gain leverage in negotiations, but these victories fall apart when confronted with the facts. This defeat in Kupyansk wasn't just on the battlefield. Putin lost in negotiations and lost credibility around the world. And there's another problem, an element here that many people don't notice. Russia is under internal pressure. Reports from November 2025 show that the money is running out, overdue salaries are increasing, and financial aid for recruits is being cut. Governors are defying orders from the Kremlin, veterans are fueling extremist groups, and crime is on the rise. Putin needs this war to end on terms he can present as a victory, but each defeat, like Kupyansk, makes that more difficult. Every exposed lie weakens his position, both outside and inside Russia. What happened in Kupyansk is a clear example of how modern warfare works. You can no longer declare false victories and expect the world to believe it. With drones recording everything on the battlefield, with presidents able to visit supposedly captured cities, with independent observers verifying every claim, the rules of the game have completely changed. Putin tried to play by the old rules, controlling the narrative, state propaganda, grand declarations. But those tactics no longer work in a world where the truth can be verified in real time and Ukraine has taken full advantage of that. They not only defended Kupyansk militarily, they turned Putin's lie into a diplomatic weapon. Every time Zelensky points to Kupyansk and says, "Look, we're still here," he is destroying the story that Russia tells of sweeping advances. This is the reality that Putin faces now. He invested his credibility in lies that have been exposed. He lost soldiers, equipment, and more importantly, he lost the bargaining power he wanted so much in the peace negotiations.
A cidade que ele declarou
A is still being defended by Ukrainian forces. The Oskil River, which he wanted to establish as the border in the agreement, remains disputed. The liberation of Kupyansk, which was reported to Vladimir Putin in November 2025, will not be remembered by history as a military triumph. It will be remembered as a clear example of modern information warfare, failure in leadership, and how the arrogance of declaring imaginary victories can turn into very real defeats, while the Kremlin tries to maintain a false image of victory. The frozen trenches of the Oskil River tell a very different story. A story written not in television statements, but in every destroyed pipeline, in every counterattack, successful in every defiant visit by a president who refuses to accept the narrative they want to impose on his country. Now, I want to know, in your opinion, why did Putin risk lying so blatantly, knowing he could be so easily exposed? Leave your opinion in the comments if this video helped you understand what is really happening in Kupyansk. Share it with someone who needs to know the truth and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next analyses. See you next time.